Healthcare is where we see all of the tensions of American political culture coming to play.
Johnson decides before the '64 election that he wants to try and pass Medicare. And he knows that healthcare legislation had been the hope and the dream of presidents before, and they had failed.
Lyndon Johnson, coming through on a huge mandate by the American people in 1964, realizes that the moment is his. He has the will to get it through. He has the power to get it through. And it takes some negotiation. Talk about the sausage making of a bill. You can really see that in the creation of Medicare.
Welcome to American Compassion, a podcast that examines the past, present, and future of the American safety net. I'm Rebecca McEnroy.
And I'm Michael Zapruder. Here we are in the third episode of our 4-episode season, looking at how Lyndon Johnson, by passing the Civil Rights Bill on July 2nd, 1964, and the Economic Opportunity Act on August 20th, 1964, is continuing the work of Franklin Roosevelt, and doing it as a sort of interim president, before he's elected in his own right in November of 1964.
An election he's nervous about, an election that could find him out of politics altogether, with an enormous amount of work not completed, and with no clear path to power within reach.
And one of the biggest goals left undone from FDR and through the terms of Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy is that of passing a comprehensive health care bill for the poor and elderly.
In this episode, we explore Medicare's tenuous road to realization and the masterminds behind its conception.
And this exploration wouldn't be possible without a man who's dedicated his life to connecting people with the help they need when they need it, and rebuilding the safety net for the 21st century and beyond.
Aaron Gray is the founder and CEO of Findhelp, a software company that helps organizations connect their communities to local social care resources. His work to modernize the American safety net via the findhelp.org network and his focus on supporting people in need have been largely shaped by both his childhood living paycheck to paycheck and by his struggle to navigate the American healthcare system.
My mom got a job at Jamestown Community College with insurance for the first time. And so when she got disabled, she was able to keep her health insurance. And I was going into my senior year in high school, and at the time I had crooked teeth. And a friend called me Fangs. And I was a kid, trying to make it. And so I got a hold of my mom's health insurance policy booklet, and I read in there, and I saw that orthodontic work was covered. And my parents did not know how to navigate stuff like that. So I found an orthodontist, which was close to my house, and I told them about the policy. Well, actually, before I did that, I went to Jamestown Community College, talked to the HR department, again, as a high school senior, and said, can I qualify to get braces? And she looked at it, she said, yes. And she gave me these forms or something. And so I went to the orthodontist, and he said, yeah, just bring one of these forms every month. And I tell you what, if you pay me $75, that'll cover it, basically. And so that's what I did, because I learned that people make judgments on you based on your teeth. And that's something that people have zero control over. A kid has zero control over the way their teeth look. And for me, that was a really important moment in my life. And it also got me thinking about how people are judged, and it's really not fair to judge them. And that's heartbreaking to me. Kids like me growing up should know about things so that they have a fighting chance to make it.
Making it in 1964, especially for a child growing up in poverty, was almost impossible. When Aaron was growing up, the system was difficult to navigate, hard to access, and broken, but at least there was a healthcare safety net. Before Medicare and Medicaid, it was a different story.
A third of all Americans over the age of 65 were living in poverty.
Mark Upton Grove is the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation in Austin, Texas.
We used to talk about people going over to the poorhouse, older people being shut out of the homes that they were living in and going to live in the poorhouse, which essentially meant they were going somewhere to die because they didn't have the basic needs to meet their health care expectations at that time. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the resources. So Medicare is a perfect example of a social safety net that was put into place not only to answer health care needs, but in order to alleviate poverty for people who would go broke trying to tend to the medical needs of a relative.
Johnson knew that his war on poverty wouldn't be effective at all without addressing health care legislation.
Robert Caro has made much of his life's work chronicling the career and life of Lyndon Johnson. He's written 4 books about Johnson and is currently working on the 5th and final planned volume of this biography. We spoke to Caro about the history of the safety net, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt and what that meant to Johnson.
What did you do? What was government's role? If you were getting old, let's say you're a factory worker, to make it simple, they're going to lay you off at the age of 60. Well, you don't have a lot of savings. What are you supposed to do for money for the rest of your life? So Roosevelt passes Social Security. That's a big part of the safety net. Now, Roosevelt saw that another part of the safety net was what we call Medicare. What did you do if you were old and sort of poor? You knew you were going to get sick. Well, how exactly were you going to pay for that? So Roosevelt is the first president to introduce health care insurance financed through Social Security. But by that time, Roosevelt has lost a lot of his power with Congress. They're not giving him that. Truman introduces it over again. He loses. Well, Eisenhower didn't try very hard. Johnson comes along, and the night of the assassination, so he takes the oath on the plane. They fly back to Washington, and he brings to his house 3 of his assistants, and he's sitting up in bed, and he says, I'm going to pass Harry Truman's health insurance bill for him. And he does it.
Again, Mark Upton Grove.
You can see Lyndon Johnson put the emphasis on this because it was so needed in order for us to be a compassionate nation, meeting our promise to the American people.
As Caro mentioned, FDR, Truman, and Kennedy had all tried to pass Medicare and failed. But why?
The opposition was formidable.
Melody Barnes teaches law at the University of Virginia. But before that, she was an aide and chief counsel to Senator Edward Kennedy. And under President Obama, Barnes was the director of the Domestic Policy Council.
It included those who, were doctors. The American Medical Association was hostile to this idea because of the way that it would affect the way they went about doing their business, and it was change. And those who had a different ideological perspective on the role of government in people's lives also were opposed to it. And so when you add those forces together, you end up with a very, very powerful block of individuals and resources, lobbying resources, that were opposed to passing Medicare and Medicaid.
And even if you're just learning about the battle for Medicare, you might recognize one voice of the opposition in particular.
My name is Ronald Reagan. I have been asked to talk on several subjects that have to do with the problems of the day. It must seem presumptuous to some of you that a member of my profession would stand here and attempt to talk to anyone on serious problems that face the nation and the world. It would be strange if it were otherwise. Most of us in Hollywood are very well aware of the concept or the misconception that many people, our fellow citizens, have about people in show business. It was only a generation ago that the people of my profession couldn't be buried in the churchyard. Of course, the world has improved since then. We can be buried now. As a matter of fact, the eagerness of some of you to perform that service gets a little frightening at times.
In 1961, the American Medical Association funded Operation Coffee Cup.
As part of Operation Coffee Cup, Ronald Reagan, who was a popular actor at the time but just getting into politics, recorded a 10-minute piece on LPs that were distributed across the nation to the Women's Auxiliary of the AMA. And they were designed to defeat Medicare by outlining the dangers of, quote, socialized medicine.
Speaking directly, Reagan gave the wives specific action items.
And the speech used one of the most effective elements of any campaign: fear.
One of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on a people has been by way of medicine. What can we do about this? Well, you and I can do a great deal. We can write to our congressmen, to our senators. We can say right now that we want no further encroachment on these individual liberties and freedoms. And at the moment, the key issue is we do not want socialized medicine. If you don't, this program, I promise you, will pass just as surely as the sun will come up tomorrow. And behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country. Until, one day, as Norman Thomas said, we will awake to find that we have socialism. And if you don't do this, and if I don't do it, one of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
So by 1964, the playing field for Medicare isn't exactly welcoming. Again, Melody Barnes.
And so when Johnson tried to do this before the 64 election, he ultimately failed. And I think so many people who talk about Johnson as though he was just waving a magic wand around and passing legislation left, right, and center forget the fact that he tried and he failed. And he had members of his own party look at him and shrug their shoulders and refuse to help him pass that piece of legislation.
Indeed, much of the strategizing and convincing was happening within the Democratic Party. Here's Johnson on September 2nd, 1964, trying to convince Senate Appropriations Committee Chairman and Arizona Democrat Carl Hayden to vote for Medicare.
I see Goldwater's flying back. He says it's going to be a mighty close vote. Is that vote going to be close today?
Where?
On Medicare.
Well,
I see in the morning television he says he's flying back from Arizona.
Vote on it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now don't you let him beat us, Carl.
Well, damn it, I voted against that before.
As I remember, though, you waited for us, didn't you, to see if we had to have you?
Yeah.
Won't you do that today?
Well, I might.
Do that now, because we can't lose this one. This is one we can't lose. We got to have these old people, and they are just thick as thieves all over the country, and that's the polls show that's the most popular issue we got.
Well,
you agree to do what you did last time, wait and see, and if we don't need you, you can do what you have to. But if we do need you, don't let us lose it, because of your vote, don't let the Republicans win over me.
I hate like hell to have that happen. On the other hand, I hate like hell to vote that way.
Well, do like you did before. Wait and see, and if we don't have to have you, well, we don't, and we hope we don't.
All right, we'll see.
Okay. Thank you.
And later that day, when the Senate vote on Medicare came up a tie, LBJ and White House counsel Meyer Feldman talk about how to break the tie using Democratic Senators Edward Kennedy, Everett Jordan, and Mike Maroney.
Hello, Mr. President. According to the count that Mike Manitas has, we have a tie vote on the Medicare amendment, so we have to get either Jordan or Maroney to give us a live pair with Teddy Kennedy. Luther Hodges has called Jordan, and Jordan is uncertain. He won't give us a commitment. The suggestion is that perhaps if you called either Maroney or Jordan, this would convince them to give us the live pair we need to carry this.
Talk to Hubert about it and tell him if he thinks I ought to call me. I don't want to do it unless I have to, and he just told me he's all right.
All right, I've just talked to Mike Manitas. All right, I'll talk to Hubert.
But one man, a Democrat representing Arkansas's 2nd Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives and chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, was a particularly sharp thorn in the side of Medicare.
The Wilbur Mills situation has deteriorated.
An awfully decent guy on the committee talked to me last week, and he said, I just have a feeling that something's going to work out, but I get nervous because Mills won't tell us anything.
And God bless him not knowing Mills and what a devious guy he is.
You're listening to American Compassion. I'm Michael Zapruder.
And I'm Rebecca McEnroy. Stay with us.
The people who are doing the work every day, they're tough. They got thick skins, they got big hearts.
We have to take care of each other.
You're listening to American Compassion because you're interested in how the American safety net came to be. So check out the stories of those who are a vital part of that safety net today.
I just wish that people would see unhoused folks as their brothers and sisters.
When we lean into people as deserving and loving members of our community, that's how we solve this thing.
Findhelp Films is a documentary storytelling initiative that shines a spotlight on some of the incredible people and organizations working to improve lives, build community, and make sure every American has the safety net they need to thrive.
I still believe America can be that shining city upon the hill for everyone.
Watch the films and subscribe to the YouTube channel at findhelpfilms.com.
Welcome back to American Compassion. I'm Michael Zapruder.
And I'm Rebecca McEnroy.
Julian Zelizer is an American political historian and the author of many books, including The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress and the Battle for the Great Society, and Taxing America, Wilbur D. Mills, Congress and the State.
Wilbur Mills, unknown to most people now. He was from Arkansas. He had become chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which is a powerful committee that had jurisdiction over taxation, Social Security, unemployment insurance, trade, and after 1965, Medicare and Medicaid. He's slightly more moderate than some of the other Southern Democrats. He doesn't stake everything on fighting civil rights. He's more of a fiscal conservative trying to limit the scope of government and how much Americans will be taxed. And he's a powerful figure.
At the time, committee chairs were really the key figures in Congress. It's different than today when party leaders have almost total control over what members do. Back in 1964 and 65, committee leaders, because of rules, norms, and the ways procedures were structured, had a lot of room to say to the head of the party, I'm not going to do what you want. And that included the President of the United States. And because of seniority, Southerners knew that they were not going to lose their jobs. They were going to stay in their seats and stay in their positions.
So Mills is one of those figures, and he's a big problem for Kennedy and then Johnson. He doesn't support a lot of the ideas that both of those presidents were fighting for, and the one idea he's really adamant against is Medicare. The idea that the government was going to expand the role of the federal government in health care and do it through the Social Security system, which meant increasing Social Security taxes. And from Kennedy's presidency beginning right through the election of 64, Mills is the prime opponent on Capitol Hill of this idea. He does everything in his power to keep it in committee, to not allow the legislation up for a vote. And even the one time it does almost get to a vote in 1964, he finds a way in what's called a conference committee, where the House and Senate work out their differences to get rid of an amendment that would have made that the law of the land.
On September 3rd, LBJ and his chief aide to Congress, Larry O'Brien, talk about the next steps for trying to pass Medicare.
My thought would be that if we could get Mills to agree that we would take Rebekoff in conference, that would be fine. If he wouldn't, I would try to instruct the conferees. Do you have any other feeling?
No, that's at the moment I share that view, but I do think this, that with the stories around the country today, we've got something going on this damn thing, and God almighty, I hate to see that leadership join with Mills in some kind of a wrap-up that screws us quickly.
So why does Wilbur Mills oppose Medicare so vehemently? Again, Julian Zelizer.
He opposes it in part because the AMA, the Organization of Doctors, is out to really kill this idea, and they're calling it socialized medicine. They're working in districts, including his district in Arkansas, to undercut support, and they're quite powerful. And second, he's worried that it's going to cost too much. And he makes this argument that the way it's structured is that Congress is going to pass the bill, which would have provided hospital insurance for elderly Americans. That's it. But over time, elderly Americans want more and more and more. And so it would get bigger. He was going to have to raise Social Security taxes, which he said would kill the Social Security program. So he attacks it the way the AMA does, and then he attacks it on kind of fiscal conservative grounds. And because of his power, until that election, even Lyndon Johnson, when he takes over the presidency, can't figure out a way around him.
On September 14th, 1964, Larry O'Brien informs LBJ about his conversation with House leaders on the next steps for Medicare.
Hello. Yeah, so I won't pursue this. I know you're busy, but I just wanted to fill you in that the way it stands is the leadership came to this conclusion. They feel that there's some merit in putting the pressure on Mills as best they could so that they get a firm agreement that it will be discussed in depth in the conference, that labor is notifying the leadership directly that they share the view, and the leadership asked me what the White House position was, and I said I would take it on my own.
All this changes after the election of '64. The majorities are all there, supportive of Medicare. At the same time, Republicans, after that election, are scrambling to say they'll support some kind of health care reform because Barry Goldwater, who lost the presidential election, had been against Medicare. So they don't want to be that anymore. So then in '65, the debate changes really quickly. It goes from a total no to, by January, you essentially have three proposals on the table. You have the administration's Medicare program, which would provide hospital insurance for everyone 65 and over. Then a group of Republicans, including a Republican on the Ways and Means Committee who's Mills' ally, John Burns of Wisconsin, he proposes a different program, Better Care, which would provide physicians insurance. It would cover the cost of going to the doctors, and it would be paid for through a combination of regular taxes, and the recipient of the benefit would pay a monthly contribution like you do with health care. And then there's a third proposal by pretty conservative Republicans called Elder Care, which essentially is a program that would provide health care for poor elderly Americans, financed through regular tax money. So you have three proposals on the table. No one knows what's going to happen, including Johnson. Johnson's very worried that because you have three proposals now, none of them is going to have enough support, including the one he wants. And so in March of 1965, during a closed-door session, when Mills is meeting with his colleagues, and this guy Wilbur Cohen is in the room as the representative of the administration, he surprises everyone, Wilbur Mills, and he says, let's put all of them into one big bill. Let's do a three-layer cake. We'll have Medicare will include hospital insurance for the elderly, paid for through Social Security taxes. Today we call that Medicare A. You would have physicians insurance paid for by a combination of general tax revenues and contributions. Today we call that Medicare B. And then you'll have this other program, which no one paid attention to, where general tax money would be used for a means-tested health care program for the poor. Today we call that Medicaid. Johnson didn't know how this was going to unfold. There's a phone conversation where you could hear Wilbur Cohen's literally explaining right after to Johnson what they just agreed to.
I think it's a great bill, Mr. President. Is that right? Yes, sir. I think you got not only everything that you wanted, but we got a lot more than on this thing. It's a real comprehensive bill. How much does it cost my budget over what we estimate? Well, I think it would be around, I'd say, $450 million more than what you estimated for the net cost of this supplementary program. Now, what do they do under that? How is that handled? Explain that to me again, over and above the King Anderson, the supplementary you stole from Burns.
Just a note here. When Johnson refers to King Anderson in this conversation, he's talking about the health insurance bill Kennedy proposed, sponsored by Senator Anderson and Representative Cecil King of California. This was one of the bills that was debated during the Kennedy administration and then folded into the three-layer cake that Julian Zelizer just described. Also, it is so interesting to hear in this conversation that LBJ wants to know exactly how this bill will work and in dollar amounts, what this will mean for people and how they'll use the service.
Yes. Well, generally speaking, it's physician services.
Physician?
Yes, in the office.
All right, now my doctor that I go out and he pumps my stomach out to see if I got any ulcers, that physician?
That's right.
All right, any medical services that are MD services?
Any MD services. Now,
all right, now how do we know, what does he charge what he wants to?
No, he can't quite charge what he wants to because this has been put in a separate fund.
Yeah.
And what the Secretary of HEW would have to do is make some kind of agreement with somebody like Blue Shield, let's say, and it would be their responsibility, under the way the chairman has provided the bill, that they would regulate the fees of, in effect, of the doctor. Because what he tried to do is to be sure that the government wasn't regulating the fees directly. It didn't deal with the individual doctor. And the bill provides that the doctor could only charge the reasonable charges, but this intermediary, the Blue Shield, would have to do all the policing so that the government wouldn't have its long hands.
All right, that's good. Now, what does it do for you, the patient, on doctors? It says that you can have doctors' bills paid up to what extent or how much or any limit?
The individual patient has to pay the first $50 deductible, and then he's got to pay 20%.
Of everything after that?
Everything after that. So that if you went to the doctor and you had a $1,000 bill, you pay the first $50, and then for the other $950, you'd have to pay 20% of that.
All right, but that keeps you hypochondriacs out.
That keeps the hypochondriacs out. At the same time, for most of the people, it would provide an overwhelming proportion of their physician's costs.
Yes, sir, and it's something that nearly everybody could endure. They could borrow that much, or their folks could get them that much to pay their part, and even if they didn't have any money. Now, what does it get you on hospital and nurses' home under the King Anderson?
Well, under the King Anderson part, you get the first 60 days of your hospital care with a $40 deductible. 40. Finally compromised on 40, Mr. President.
That's good.
And then in addition, it has the three other benefits that were in your bill, namely the home health services, the outpatient diagnostic, and we fixed that amendment up the way you remember the way the Mayo brothers talked to you and me about. And then the only one change was for the home health services. That has to be after you get out of the hospiel.
That's good. All right. Now, what are the insurance companies? Are they still raising hell?
Well, yes, I think they're going to go over to the Senate and raise hell on the thing, because quite frankly, there's no longer any room for the private insurance companies to sell insurance policies for people over 65 when you take the combination of hospital care and the physician services.
Yeah, okay. Now, I think that's wonderful. Now, remember this, 9 out of 10 things that I get in trouble on is because they lay around. And tell the Speaker and Wilbur to please get a rule just the moment they can.
They want to bring it up next week, Mr.
Yeah, but you just tell them not to let it lay around. Do that. They want to, but they might not. Then that gets the doctors organized. Then they get the others organized. And I've damn near killed my education bill letting it lay around.
Yeah.
It stinks. It's just like a dead cat on the door. When a committee reports it, you better either bury that cat or get it some life in it.
The Speaker is saying to me, he says he's way ahead of you, Mr. President. He's going to get that on the House calendar next week and get it going so the doctors...
Well, congratulations to you. Now, let me talk to Carl if he's there.
All right, thank you.
LBJ speaking with Welfare Assistant Secretary Wilbur Cohen on March 23rd, 1965.
And that legislation is unbeatable because it includes what everyone wanted. It contains the costs because it won't expand, because now you're including like doctor's insurance, so it's there from the start. And Johnson gives the signal to his team, let Mills take the credit if he can figure this out. He's okay with that. He just wants the legislation.
Wilbur Mills talked with LBJ on March 23, 1965, after the approval that day of a new Medicare measure by the House Ways and Means Committee.
We've agreed and we've changed the bill now to conform to their line of thinking.
Well, I'll get out a statement and congratulate the committee and congratulate you. And for God's sakes, don't let dead cats stand on your porch. Mr. Rayburn used to say they stunk and they stunk and they stunk. When you get one out of that committee, you call that son of a bitch up before they can get their letters written.
You know that's the way I practice.
I sure do. I know where you learned it.
Mills walks out of this as the architect of the program. And Mills knew that something was going to pass after the 64 election, so he didn't want to be on the losing side, and that turned him. And then this compromise they work out where you're covering physicians' bills through something else satisfied his concerns about Social Security. I love that story because it is literally legislative compromise and negotiation in the most vivid example. One thing it took was the election. Without that, you don't get Medicare. Part of it was Johnson saying, presidents have to give room for others to take credit, especially in Congress, on breakthroughs. I think with Wilbur Mills, it took an element of politics we never appreciate. Today is the era we talk purely about flip-flopping and hypocrisy. But I think part of what some legislators have done in the past, and Mills is an example there, they turn their position. When conditions change, when the atmosphere changes, they are willing to do that. They are willing to stand for something that they previously opposed, or vice versa. And being willing to do that then opens the door to movement on legislation in important ways. And finally, I talked about someone named Wilbur Cohen, who was a key figure in Social Security politics. No one knows who he is. But if you were in Washington, everyone knew who he was. And he and Mills worked for years on this. They were negotiating from 1961 through 65 all the time. They had private meetings. Cohen was in meetings with the Ways and Means Committee. Legislation can take a long time. And the relationship they formed was so important because over the years they kept refining the proposals and figuring out ways to address what Mills was saying about taxation, so that by the time the window opens in 65 and this weird convergence of events creates an opportunity, Cohen and Mills had done enough legwork that they could move fast and they could get it done, and they trusted each other, even though they were very different politically, to work out that final deal. So those relationships really did matter, but again, only in the context of a Congress which was going to create the votes that you needed. In Congress, it's about math. You have the votes or you don't. Once you have the votes, that's when the personal relationships become quite important.
The final Medicare and Medicaid bill passed both houses of Congress by an overwhelming vote. President Johnson signed the bill, making it the law of the land, July 30th, 1965, in Independence, Missouri, in the presence of former President Truman. Later, President Johnson helped President Truman sign up for the voluntary part of Medicare.
He told me, President Truman, that if you wish to get the voluntary medical insurance, that you'll have to sign this application form. And they asked me to sign as your witness. So you're getting special treatment since cards won't go out to the other folks until the end of this month. But we wanted you to know, and we wanted the entire world to know, that we haven't forgotten who is the real daddy of Medicare.
For over 57 years, we've had Medicare and Medicaid in the United States, and we asked Robert Caro about the significance of such safety net legislation.
What is a safety net? It's saying to people who are sort of powerless that government is going to help you. This is what government can do for the powerless. This is what Roosevelt was saying. This is what government can do so you don't have an impoverished old age. This is what government can do so you can get medical care for your old age. For the poor kids, you say, this is what Medicaid can do. Now, I have a sort of hard to describe muscle problem with my eyes. So there's a clinic in New York that you can go to. There's an expert in this, and it's a very, you may say, a clinical atmosphere. That's a nice way of saying something. So it's a huge place. They have 7 doctors there, as I recall. They have a big waiting room. They probably have 50 or 60 chairs. And there are 5 or 6 young women doing nothing but making appointments and typing up prescriptions. And the first thing you noticed, or I noticed, when they say, I'm the only white face in this room. And there's a lot of black mothers with little, they all seem to be boys, I have to say, but with little children. And the little boys all have these glasses with thick Coke bottle, what we used to call Coke bottle lenses. So after I finished with this doctor, sort of became friendly with him because I kept going back so many times, I said, before Medicare, he corrected me, he said, no, Medicaid. I'm always making that mistake. I said, okay, before Medicaid, what percentage of these kids would have been here? And he looked at me as though I'm really dumb and said, absolutely none. So I said, you mean before Medicaid, if you were a poor mother and you had a child with a severe muscle problem, the child was going to have to go through life wearing these thick glasses? And he says, that's the way it was. And you say, what you call a safety net, which is really government using its power on behalf of the powerless. That's what a safety net is. There's so much more to do, There's such great injustices and inequalities in America that you really hesitate to say, but when you look back on the 20th century, you say, yes, but in many ways, it's a lot better than it was.
Coming up in the next episode of American Compassion.
Lyndon Johnson viewed Medicare as it was created as only a first step. See, when you talk about Lyndon Johnson and the safety net, when you talk about Johnson in general, you have to say, well, what he did in domestic affairs was wonderful, but there's Vietnam.
American Compassion, an exploration of the past, present, and future of the American safety net, is produced in Austin and Houston, Texas, with support from Findhelp.
Michael Zapruder arranged and composed the music for this show and played guitar, with Jeff Olson on drums, Mike St. Clair on bass, and Sam Littman on keys.
Special thanks to our guests for this episode: Aaron Gray, Guion McKee, Melody Barnes, Julian Zelizer, Mark Updegrove, and Robert Caro.
Also thanks to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, C-SPAN, the American Presidency Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum in Austin, Texas, for their consultation and use of archived materials.
Jim Tuttle is our advising editor. Rebecca McEnroy is our executive producer. And for American Compassion, I'm Michael Zapruder. Thanks for listening.